I'd like to welcome Nathalie. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Nathalie today, who's presenting this webinar. Nathalie is a certified conservation coach with the Global Conservation Coaches Network, and she's got more than 20 years experience in conservation planning, project management, and community engagement within the not-for-profit sector. She's currently policy planning coach within the Nature Conservancy's Global Policy and Public Funding team. So today she brings to this topic a really rich history in conservation, use of the conservation standards and policy. So
thank you, Sarah. And thank you for having me here.
Nathalie, thank you so much for sharing your experience and insights, and over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen.
Sorry, my internet's unstable.
Bear with me while I hit the share button, and hopefully it won't rearrange things too much. All right, and then hopefully you are now all seeing my screen.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so I just wanted to give you an overview. I'm going to do a couple of things in this session, hopefully time permitting. One is just give an overview of kind of policy considerations in conservation planning generally. The second is introduce you to a couple of tools that we've been using within the Nature Conservancy for thinking about conservation planning. And then thirdly, if we get time, we'll do a bit of an exercise to apply a couple of those tools. One of the things I just wanted to put out there firstly is that I'm giving you this presentation based on some tools and approaches that we've been developing within the Nature Conservancy, which includes adaptations of other tools and policy tools and approaches that are sort of publicly available. We'd ask that if you'd like to use any of them, that you just reference it being sourced from and acknowledge the Nature Conservancy and or the original source of the tools if you were using those directly. And I would love, in the spirit of, the Conservation Coaches Network, for anyone to, if you use and adapt the tools yourselves, that you also share those adaptations back with the network as well, so that we can all continue to learn from that experience. So, firstly, I'll just give a bit of an overview of policy and conservation at TNC and how that comes together. And I thought it would be useful to start by providing a definition for policy. This is how TNC sees policy. It might be slightly different in your own organisations, but hopefully you can relate to it and see how it might be similar or different to the work you're doing in your own organisations. So at TNC, like many conservation organisations, we view science as the underpinning for so much of our work. So science informs our understanding of natural systems, the interactions between people and nature, and what we are trying to achieve and the actions we need to take. So we use that science to set our goals of what we're trying to achieve and to use that information to inform the actions we take to protect and restore the lands and waters and wildlife that are the focus of our work, and to help shift how people and communities interact with the natural environment and to sustain their cultures and livelihoods whilst also, achieving those conservation outcomes that we seek to achieve. Behind all of our efforts, all of us in all of our different organisations operate within the contexts of rules, regulations, laws, international agreements, public institutions and financing that shape and sometimes constrain what's possible and who pays how much for what. So the way we see policy is that it's about formally shaping these rules of the game at every level. So that might be local, subnational, national and global. It's about becoming part of the policy processes that allocate funding for our priorities, whether it is a government budget process or an international organisation's funding decisions on their priorities and programs. It's also about designing policy that enables conservation solutions that we want to see adopted. And informally, it's about shaping what policymakers and the broader public perceive as both possible and desirable and hopefully inspiring and influencing them to adopt the conservation solutions that we want to see taken forward. So all of these elements come into how policy is viewed and defined at TNC. So within TNC, we describe policy as something that shapes the incentives and disincentives that drive public behaviour, that removes barriers that impede desired behaviour, and that allocates funding among priorities. So how much funding and for what purpose? So how does policy fit into our conservation work at TNC at least? So TNC, I'm sure like many other organisations, recognises that we're facing two interrelated crises at the moment. One is the rapid climate change and the other is biodiversity loss. And as an organisation, we've set goals that we want to achieve in terms of how we're going to respond and try and address those crises. But we also recognise that we're not going to be able to reach our own internal organisational goals through a business as usual approach. They're reasonably ambitious goals, and we recognise that we instead need to accelerate the scale and pace of our conservation work. And one way we can do that is through transformative policy processes. So on the screen at the moment is the kind of TNC's priorities and how it reflects internally and organises around those priorities. So those priorities are protect, provide and climate. And then there's a number of kind of global focuses within that. The way policy is viewed within TNC is that it's a cross-cutting transformative function. So it goes across all of those different focus areas and is needed to achieve our goals for 2030 that the organisation has set. So as we saw in the previous slide, policy that generates the rules that influences behaviour change and influences the allocation of public funding is essential to sustained and transformational conservation actions that can be replicated at scale. And we see it as an important systemic change lever because it can influence and be replicated beyond where the initial investment occurred. It can sustain desired behaviour change through allocation of funding and resources, and can change the rules of the game that we're all operating within. So that's how it's viewed within TNC. The next thing I just wanted to mention is that there's also recognition, obviously, within the conservation standards community and the conservation measures partnership of the need to understand the pathways to scale our conservation work. And some of you may have seen or been involved in the project Taking Conservation to Scale, which identified a number of pathways to scale, which are what's in this slide. So the pathways that were identified through a project undertaken by the Conservation Measures Partnership identified, potentially scaling out, so expanding the initial project scope, then replicating projects across programs, so that replication sort of side of things is another mechanism of getting to scale, and then promoting diffusion of innovation in different places as another mechanism for getting to scale. And then there was scaling up, so changing the system conditions for everywhere we work. So we might want to achieve it for one particular place, but by changing those system conditions, it actually changes it for the whole system. And then the final one that they identified was scaling deep, so transforming the system intent. And I'm sure you can see the potential for policy to play a role in a number of those pathways to scale. And back to a TNC perspective, there's a number of different actions that we see fits into this sort of policy space and policy work. And so at TNC, the toolkit for advancing policy action ranges from policy design, so that's translating science into formats that can be used to influence policy design, and also the drafting of legislation. There's policy planning and research. That might be research on the political, economic and/or social elements of the policy issue and the potential solutions. as well as approaches to achieve those solutions. So policy research and planning is critically important to designing what those actual policy outcomes might be. Policy advocacy is the actual work of influencing the decision makers to gain support for your solutions. And then shaping policy agendas and funding is contributing to the policy processes that shape political agendas and influencing the allocation of funding, whether that be by global funding institutes or local governments, or national or state governments, depending on the context of where you're working. And then shaping perceptions is, that relationship building, the strategic communications, the working with government officials, policymakers, partners, and potentially the general public to get support for the policy solutions. And I would note that there's overlap and interaction amongst all of these actions as they contribute to and support each other. I would also note that these might look different at your own organisations. You may undertake some of these, but not all of them. And you may undertake actions that TNC doesn't necessarily get involved in as well, because all of our organisations have different ways that they engage in that sort of policy space. The other thing I wanted to note just before we get into how it fits into the conservation planning process is that you may be familiar with this sort of idea of sphere of control, sphere of influence, and then sphere of impact. So in relation to policy, we find it's helpful to understand that the policy outcomes we're working towards are always going to be outside our sphere of control, because we're relying on decisions being taken and actions being taken by others. TNC as an organisation doesn't get to make a policy decision. We can try to catalyse, we can promote, we could try to facilitate, we can try to influence and support policy decisions, but ultimately it's the policymakers who make the decision and take the action that we're trying to achieve. So it's a really interesting space to just be cognizant of that fact that we're trying to influence others to take action. We are not, it's not within our control in this particular case. So how do we go about considering policy in conservation planning? Broadly at TNC, we talk about policy showing up in two different ways in our kind of conservation strategies. The first of those is that policy might be part of a broader conservation strategy where a policy intervention might be one of the interventions that's needed alongside other interventions or actions in order to achieve an outcome. The second way it shows up for us as an organisation is that policy as a conservation strategy in its own right, where the conservation strategy is focused almost solely or specifically on policy change as the key lever in order to achieve your outcomes. We also suggest to our teams internally that policy strategies, just like conservation strategies, require planning and adaptive management, and that the same approaches that we use for conservation planning can be used to plan for policy strategies, and to incorporate policy into conservation strategies. So this diagram you should all hopefully be familiar with. It's the basic conservation standards diagram. We've adapted this and aligned some of the policy tools that we have to the conservation standards cycle, and I'll take you through how we see that happening. So firstly, in the assess part of the assess phase, the focus here in relation to policy is on understanding and describing the policy system. And one of the tools I'm going to take you through is something that we use to help teams try and describe the current policy system and to understand which elements of that policy system they're looking to change. And there may be specific research and analysis that's needed to support that. In the next phase, the plan phase, you are still undertaking all of the usual steps you would in that particular phase of identifying strategies, defining your outcomes, undertaking and designing a theory of change, incorporating intermediate results. But we've got a tool that I'm going to again take you through on this call that just helps think through what that could look like for policy and what some of the common elements of a policy theory of change might be. Then in the implement part of the process, this is where you're directly taking actions to influence the enabling conditions for conservation. This might be influencing people, markets, institutions, governments, and it might take the form of advocacy or lobbying. And you might also be looking to influence the funding that's available and the priorities of where funding is being spent. The final tool that I'm going to share today is just one that helps you think through potentially some of the skill sets that might be needed to implement those policy interventions. And it also helps you think through what some of those actions might be. And then to complete out the cycle, the analyse and adapt phase, policy measures are just as important here as they are in a conservation strategy to enable that adaptive management. One of the more challenging parts here, I think, that we face in our organisation and others might as well, is how do you estimate the contribution of policy towards your outcomes, and when do you say you've achieved that? And that's an ongoing evolution even within our own organisation about how we do that and what that looks like. And then share is the usual part of that cycle of being able to then just share to enable replication of the policy actions and catalyse new actions. So these are the 5 frameworks that our team has been working on developing. I'm going to take you through 3 of those today. And so that's the policy competency continuum, policy system model, and the policy process model. So firstly, the policy system model. So this model is actually adapted from the Overseas Development Institute, and we use this model to think about policy as a system that is made up of components that fall into 3 basic categories. One is content, the other is structure, and the final is narrative. And they're obviously interlinked and overlapping, but the way we describe it, so the content is the actual treaties, the laws, the formalised agreements, the regulations, the budgets, policy guidance that makes up the content of the policy system. Policy structures are the national or subnational operational mechanisms. So this is the agencies, the departments that are responsible for implementing the content and the way they go about doing that. And the final one is the narrative. So this is issue framing and strategic messaging that initially describes what that narrative is currently, but also might be, well, how do we want to change that narrative? Policy change can occur via any of those categories. It might be like that you're focused in on a particular one. It might be that you're trying to achieve change in all of those categories. And just to give you an example, so if we think about the Paris Climate Agreement as one of the agreements that fits into that kind of content side of things, the Green Climate Fund might be one of the operational mechanisms under the Paris Climate Agreement. And then an example of the narrative related to that is natural climate solutions. So we want natural climate solutions to be considered as one of those kind of tools that we can use, but that comes into that sort of narrative way of thinking about things. A second example is around recycling. So we may have, or we may be working to achieve legislation that mandates recycling. But we also need financial incentives and mechanisms for actually undertaking the recycling. And then we may want to achieve the narrative that recycling is good for the planet in order to, reinforce the need for legislation and why people do the financial incentives to actually undertake the recycling. So it's, like I said, it's a tool that we try and use to both help in the situation analysis phase of the conservation standards to think about what the current context is. So what is that current, what is the current content? What is the current structure? What is the current narrative? And then also to think about, well, how do we want to change that narrative, or how do we want to change that content? So what is it we're trying to change? And as I said, it might be in any one or multiple of those different categories. And this is just a quick example that comes from the Northern Caribbean, and was some work that TNC was undertaking for many years to secure a commitment from the government of the Bahamas to expand the country's marine protected area network to 20% by 2020 in this case. And they'd developed an initiative, they'd done a lot of work, they'd actually got preliminary endorsement from the government for the plan. But before it was able to be finalised, there was 2 major external events, specifically Hurricane Dorian and then the COVID-19 pandemic, that really shifted the government focus. And there was concern that the declaration of new marine protected areas would actually hurt rather than help the economic recovery focus that was the focus of the government. So the team that our team was working with went through a process to reassess the changed political context and then reframe its advocacy efforts. And one of the critical things that they found in that case was it was changing the narrative and being able to demonstrate how the marine protected area proposal, would actually support economic recovery in that case and the needs of local communities. So it was helping them just reframe what they needed to focus on in order to get to the outcome they were trying to achieve. So
I was just letting you know there's 8 minutes. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. The next tool I wanted to just touch on is the policy process model. And I think for anyone who's regularly developing or reviewing theories of change, particularly theories of change that with policy involved, that you might be able to relate to this cartoon that you've probably seen before in the Where a Miracle Occurs part. And from the outside policy work, and certainly for me, because I'm not necessarily a policy expert, policy work might seem like a black box where you know that it can produce a particular result, but you don't necessarily understand the process of how it happens, which is the bit where the miracle occurs in the middle. And so the policy process model is really trying to break down the giant leap from where we are to where we're trying to get to into a series of kind of smaller steps and inform then the development of intermediate results. So this is the policy process model. And really it's kind of almost a generic theory of change that was developed internally within TNC by our Policy Measures Advisory Group to try and help clarify that policy change process. And so it's made up of a set of non-linear phases in that there's no set starting point. The phases might be happening concurrently, and sometimes you might need to move backwards to move forwards. But those phases are, so framing the issue. So the issue is framed to support a dialogue or alignment on shared values and interest. Increasing awareness, and so that is about increasing the knowledge, awareness or perception of the issue or policy need. Then it's about increasing issue salience. So the issue salience is the significance or relevance of the issue to policymakers. So they might be aware of a policy issue, but if they don't see its relevance and its importance, they may not be prepared to take action on it. So this phase is around trying to increase how they perceive the importance of the issue so that they are then willing to take action. Then increasing political will is getting them then willing to act on that issue. And the next step is the taking policy action or the policy decision. So that is where, legislation is passed or an agreement is signed. That's the actual policy outcome. The policy decision is made. But again, that's not sufficient as an end in its own right. We then want to see that policy implemented. And for example, that's another one where you might actually have to go through around the cycle again to build the importance of the issue, the awareness of the issue, and the political will related to the issue to then get the policy implemented. And, you might have examples which I think commonly happens in our organisation, where you've been able to frame the issue, you've increased awareness, you've increased the issue salience, you've increased political will, and then there's an election and you go back to the drawing board and start that process again because all of the decision makers have changed, just as an example. So where does this fit in the process? So we use this in developing results chains and the theory of change as just a framing to help teams think about, well, what might some of those intermediate results be? And we encourage them to frame, well, what is the policy outcome, being the policy decision or the implementation, or both, that they're seeking to achieve through that policy. The other thing I should add is within TNC, the way we view a policy outcome is still as an intermediate result towards an ultimate outcome being the outcome for people or nature, so the actual conservation or human wellbeing outcome. And it can also help in unpacking the assumptions in a theory of change. And this is an example, this one's from Brazil. They were working on getting a new policy in place that recognised and enabled the Indigenous decision-making over land, and went through, they had multiple kind of strategies that they were working to achieve to build the support and the political will in order to get to the policy outcome they were looking to achieve in that case. The final tool is the policy competency continuum. And this is a way of recognising that policy work is complex and requires a diverse array of skill sets and expertise in order to design and implement the appropriate policy action. So the competency continuum attempts to give some clarity and organisation to that array of skills and to help teams think through the different skill sets and expertise that might be needed at different parts in the process as well, or depending on what you're trying to achieve. So there might be different things you need at different times. And it can also help teams in thinking about when they come to that implementation phase, who needs to be involved, what skill sets do they need, where might they have gaps in those skill sets, and therefore how are they going to fill those gaps. And then this is just the greater detail on each of those things that were identified in the continuum to give you a sense, at least internally within TNC, of some of the things that we're looking at in terms of the skills that are needed. I also find this one as a great tool for thinking about the prompting of actions that might be needed as well. So the activities that might be needed to support implementation of your theory of change. So that's the tools. The final thing I just wanted to share was some external resources. So these are not TNC resources, and all of these are available online, but that are really useful resources if you're interested in focusing on policy work and the interplay of policy and conservation planning. So the webinar recording will be made available, and I can share the slides from the presentation as well, so you've got access to those policy resources. One of the really great ones, if you haven't seen it before, is this ORS Impact Pathways to Change. So they've got 10 kind of standard theories of change to inform advocacy and policy change. And it talks you through like what, depending on your context, there might be a different kind of theory of change that suits your needs, but there's some really good resources in there. And then the USAID resource is specifically around working politically when practicing the conservation standards at USAID. So that's another one that's worth looking at. So I'm going to stop there and come back so I can see everyone and just see if there's any questions. Otherwise, we're going to try and have a shot at using a couple of the tools on a hypothetical example. So please feel free to either raise your hand, to come off mute, or to put a question in the chat if you've got a question.
Nathalie, quick one.
Yes, go ahead, Livanita.
Yeah, so I assume you're treating, whenever you do policy planning and whatnot, you're treating it like a thematic program or project?
It depends on the context. So some teams, it is very much, well, it might be geographic focused. And for example, I just recently did a process with specifically our Ecuador team that was working on resilient watersheds in Ecuador. But it was specifically the process we were going through was the policy elements related to that work. So there was obviously the other elements that they're working on directly through their conservation work. And the process that we were focused on was, well, can we build out a theory of change for the policy specific component of that? But in that case, it was geographically focused. They had particular outcomes they wanted to achieve for particular geographies within Ecuador, but the policy outcomes they articulated and wanted to achieve would also have broader ramifications for the whole of Ecuador. So they were wanting to achieve these for specific locations and geographies, but it would be more general as well. Other cases, so I did another process with our greening sovereign debt team, and it was much more thematic focused. It will eventually touch down in a place, but the process we went through was almost at a global level as well.
Right. So the Ecuador project, they do have like species targets and ecosystem targets there, but okay, then you guys come in.
Yeah,
like,
we were coming in to support them specifically to better articulate the policy element of it. So I don't necessarily take themes through the whole process of their species targets, but I do then try and support them to articulate, well, what are those ultimate conservation outcomes you are trying to achieve in relation to, TNC generally has other broader strategies that it's already articulated for some of those parts of the process.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problems. Any other questions? No? Well, feel free to jump off at any time and ask questions. And I can see we've got a number of people here who are outside of Australia. So I hope the activity we have will resonate. It is an Australia-specific one, and it actually comes from BirdLife Australia. So it's not a TNC example because most of mine are now international in the role that I'm in. But I'm going to share my screen again for a moment. And just talk you through. So this is the example. And as I said, this is one, it's a particular threatened species, the swift parrot, which breeds in Tasmania and spends the summers in Tasmania, and then migrates to the mainland of Australia for the winter and basically follows flowering forests because it's a nectar feeder. But it relies on old growth, hollow bearing trees for nesting and breeding in Tasmania. And there's a national recovery plan for it. And one of the key threats to the breeding habitat, and therefore key threats to the species, is logging in its breeding habitat. And in Australia, there is current federal environment and biodiversity legislation But at this point in time, there is what's called regional forest agreements that have been in place that are agreements between the federal and state governments. And in the case of Tasmania, they are actually still allowing logging in some of the critical swift parrot habitat. So what we thought we could do was, just using this as a hypothetical example, try and apply the policy system model to thinking around, well, what might some of those elements be of the content, the narrative, and the structure that is related to this particular policy issue, if we're talking about what policy change might be needed to support swift parrot recovery. So what I'm going to do is escape out of this, and I've got a mural set up that I can share the link for in the chat. Okay, so the link to the mural is in the chat. So I've just put in there a blank kind of policy system model. But what I'd love to get people to do is just think about, and don't feel you have to get caught up in the details of whether it's accurate or actually right or not. But what might be some of those elements of content, narrative, and structure relative to this particular issue and this species. And I'm happy for people to even just add things in the chat or make up stuff, to be honest. It doesn't have to be accurate, but just thinking about, all right, given that sort of context that I described, how would we describe that, that issue? What are the elements of content that might be relevant to this particular species and issue? What are the elements of structure? And what might be elements of the narrative? So feel free to add anything directly in there, but I'd ask particularly Sarah, if you're there, if you're happy to add, potentially some of the other Australians on the call, just because you might feel more comfortable coming up with some content, if you would be happy to go in there and add some content, just so that teams can see how this might work.
Thanks, Nathalie.
Sorry, for some reason it's not letting me actually type in there. I had to send an edit link that went to somebody's email address in order to be
That
able
will
to
have
type.
gone to mine. Bear with me. I'll try and pull this over here so we don't all sit down and see my email. Let me check the settings here. Okay. It might not let you do that. That's going to be annoying. All right. Well, perhaps if people could put anything in the chat or come off mute and share anything you think might fit into any of those categories, and I can add the content in. Because it doesn't look like Zoom's going to cooperate, or Mural's going to cooperate with me today.
So content, regional forest agreements,
yep,
the EPBC Act, probably Tasmanian Threatened Species Acts, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And it's Sarah here, Nathalie. Sorry, I've got issues with my camera. But around the narrative about there being different rules for different players,
yep,
and the need for alignment. So
would you mind, Sarah, expanding on that, just because I'm conscious we've got a number of folks here from Malaysia and elsewhere?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good point. Yeah, so because the regional forestry agreements, basically they make them that sort of process exempt from our national laws. So there's sort of a lack of alignment or inconsistency about what we're sort of promoting from a national perspective for protection of biodiversity versus to what's being able to be enacted on a sort of regional basis within Australia. So there's inconsistency there to the detriment of biodiversity. So it's really looking for having consistency of rules across those different sort of levels, whether it be national or the regional levels, and that they're aligned, and that they improve in the first place. Yeah.
I think also just the urgency that we have less than 500 swift parrots left in the world.
Yes.
And so this is an urgent issue that requires attention.
Yeah.
Awesome. Anything on the structure sort of side of things, the operational mechanisms of this?
Well, I guess other than the agreements themselves, because it's sort of like the mechanism, I think, unless I'm getting a little bit confused there. Yeah. So, and I guess by the diagram, there's the overlapping between them. So,
yeah. And so where do you think there's the potential, or where there might be opportunities to change this? Is it you know, the changing of the regional forest agreements themselves? Is it changing of the EPBC Act? Where do you think there might be opportunities? Is it changing of the narrative? It might be both, but where do you see there potential opportunities for change, policy change in this space to you know, achieve the outcome that the policy supports the conservation of the swift parrot rather than helping contribute to its decline, perhaps?
I think like the big lesson that I guess feel like I'm taking away today is I feel like my whole world to date has been focused on the science and the narrative, and then thinking about how you can best shape that narrative very succinctly to push it through to the content, like really being crystal clear in how the two things are related, so that policymakers are more easily able to digest the information that you're giving and going, exactly schedule 1.3 of the blah blah act needs rewording to say this, or you know, whatever that looks like, to make it crystal clear.
And I think for me, Natalie, it's I will caveat this with I don't work closely in this area. However, in some other work that I've done with BirdLife, just having that really good understanding, because in Australia there's that lack of alignment between the national and sort of regional state territory level. And then there can also be some inconsistencies at the local sort of government level as well. So it's really having that understanding of, well, what is the complete state of play and how do they interact, so you can identify the multiple pressure points, I guess, that you might need to be aiming to influence. Because if it was nice and neat and all aligned, it would probably be one spot. But it's having an understanding of that, so you know, obviously multiple approaches that are needed to address that.
And that's where we still use the traditional, like, conservation standards conceptual model diagrams as well, to be able to tease all of that out, and what are the drivers and how do they interplay as well. This is just, I certainly coming into the policy space as relatively new to policy, I found this framing useful to think about what are those elements of policy, because you know, I certainly, you know, your mind immediately goes to legislation. It's like, well, what are those other elements that are needed that might be relevant? And it may not just be the legislation. The legislation might exist, but it's not being implemented. So what's going on there? Is there a narrative that we need to change? And I think I mentioned earlier on the, you know, grey infrastructure versus green infrastructure, for example, for coastal resilience. It might be that all of that there is processes there to do, you know, whatever coastal protection, but the narrative is all around grey infrastructure, and we want to change that narrative so people see green infrastructure as a viable solution and a potential option in that sort of space. So I find this useful. It doesn't necessarily replace the conceptual diagrams in conservation standards. It's just a tool that can help add to it or help thinking about those elements of it. So.
And I certainly see how they would go hand in hand, Nathalie, as well, in terms of, you know, revisiting it and saying what has changed in the situation at any given time. Have there been any changes where you may then sort of focus more on the narrative or the content, or it might shift your approach as well to sort of keep up to speed with any changes. Yeah. Thank you.
And if you get a change in government, all right. So has the narrative changed? The content probably won't change that quickly, but perhaps the narrative has changed. Maybe it's more sympathetic and there's an opportunity. Maybe it's gone the other way and we've got a government that is less interested and the narrative has changed there. And it's going to be a harder case to then get the things we want in place.
Yeah.
So I'll just show you down the bottom here in the mural I had added, just we won't have time to do it today, but an exercise around thinking about what some of those intermediate results could look like for each of those parts of the policy process model. So framing the issue, increasing awareness, increasing issue salience or the importance and relevance of the issue, increasing political will, then getting to the policy decision and the implementation. So I'm going to pause there to give us time, again, if there's any questions, or for wrap up if there's no questions. So any questions? Any reflections on how you do it, you deal with policy within your own organisations? Please feel free to either come off mute or put something in chat.
I guess just for me, it is that concept of policy is often this big black box, that there is this great divide between conservation practitioners and the policymakers. And it's really interesting in the koala strategy program that I work in, they actually moved the koala strategy team to be in the same team with policy because, you know, koalas and very much human-driven issues, and so it was really interesting that they did that to try and sort of get closer conversation between the two groups, but still policy feels like a big black box. And
we still have that in TNC. I think, you know, our team is working to help our teams that are specifically policy focused to develop theories of change. And our experience is that they might be less familiar with some of these conservation planning approaches because they haven't necessarily been through them before, whereas a lot of the conservation staff are more familiar with this sort of process. So it can still be applied and we are taking them through it, but potentially it's a newer way of thinking about things. But I hope we will get to the point where they'll see the value so that they can articulate their strategies for policy in the same way that our conservation strategies do. Over to you, Sarah.
All right, I might hop in and say thank you very much, Nathalie, for that. I think it's certainly an incredibly complex area, and I think that those tools really help unpack some